Have you ever heard of a knife of sugar? It's a phrase an Indian nationalist, Dadabhai Naoroji, used to describe British rule. You see, on the surface, it seemed sweet, promising all this progress and modernity. But underneath, that sweet promise was a blade, and it was bleeding the nation dry. And the sharpest edge of that knife? It was a powerful economic idea we all know, the free market. So how on earth did an ideology that was celebrated for creating incredible wealth in Britain become a tool for economic ruin in India? How did a promise of prosperity lead to unimaginable poverty and famine? Well, let's get into it.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the promise of free market theory itself. Then, we'll see how that ideology was, let's say, selectively applied in India. From there, we'll chart the ruin of the economy and uncover the devastating human costs of this dogma. Then we're going to unpack this crucial idea of the drain of wealth. And finally, we'll see how this whole history left behind a deep legacy of distrust that shaped modern India for decades.
All right, let's dive in. Before we can really understand the disaster, we have to understand the ideal. What was this whole laissez-faire economics thing supposed to be? Because in its purest form, it was, well, a pretty revolutionary idea.
Okay, so the term laissez-faire, it's French, and it literally means let do, or maybe a better translation is let it be. It popped up back in the 18th century as a major pushback against governments that had their hands in everything. The idea was simple but radical. Get the state out of the way and just let the market do its thing.
And this brings us to Adam Smith's super famous invisible hand, right? The idea is that a baker doesn't bake your bread because he's a great guy, he does it to make a profit. But in chasing his own self-interest, he accidentally ends up feeding the whole neighborhood. The theory is that the market, as if guided by an invisible hand, channels all our selfish little actions into a result that's good for everybody.
Now, this didn't mean no government at all. The role of the state was just meant to be incredibly limited. Adam Smith himself said the government really only has 3 jobs. 1, protect the country from invasion. 2, protect citizens from each other with the justice system. And 3, build the big, essential stuff that a private company could never profit from, like bridges or lighthouses. For pretty much everything else, the government was supposed to just let do.
So, that was the beautiful theory. It sounds pretty good on paper, right? But what happens when you take that idea and apply it not in your own country, but in a colony like India? Well, this is where that beautiful ideal smacks right into a brutal and frankly hypocritical reality.
And here's the core problem, laid out side by side. The doctrine preached minimal state intervention, but in India, the colonial state intervened massively, guaranteeing huge profits for British railway investors using Indian tax money. The doctrine preached free competition for all, but in India, it was a state-enforced one-way free trade. British goods poured into India with 0 tariffs, while Indian goods trying to get into Britain got slapped with heavy taxes. In short, laissez-faire wasn't a principle, it was a weapon. It was a rule applied to Indians, but never, ever by the British.
So what's the result when you apply an economic theory in such a selective, self-serving way? Well, it wasn't development. It was the exact opposite. It was a process that historians have a very specific name for, de-industrialization. It was the systematic takedown of what was once a global economic powerhouse.
The numbers here, they just tell an incredible story. In the year 1700, India was a manufacturing giant, responsible for almost a quarter of the entire world's industrial output. Think about that. 1 in every 4 things made in the world came from India. But by 1913, after decades of these colonial policies, its share had just collapsed. This wasn't a story of falling behind. This was the story of being actively pushed off the cliff.
Let's just zoom in on textiles for a second, which was India's #1 industry. Thanks to that one-way free trade, we see this catastrophic reversal. What does this number, a swing of over 16 crore rupees, actually mean? It means an entire industry was gutted. It means millions of skilled weavers, spinners, and artisans lost their livelihoods. It was an economic U-turn of epic proportions.
And this economic run wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It had a terrifying, very real human cost. It created a society that was incredibly fragile, incredibly vulnerable. So, what do you think happened when this rigid, dogmatic policy ran headfirst into a natural disaster?
This is the crucial question we have to ask. The British often blame the horrible famines of the late 19th century on the monsoon failing. An act of God, a natural disaster. But was it really that simple? Or were these famines actually a direct result of colonial policy?
Were they a man-made catastrophe, born from a brutal, almost religious adherence to economic dogma?
The scale of the tragedy is it's almost impossible to comprehend. During just one of these events, the Great Famine of 1876 to 78, it's estimated that up to 10 million people starved to death. 10 million. That's more than the entire population of many European countries back then. This wasn't just a food shortage, it was a holocaust of hunger.
And this right here, this quote reveals the horrifying logic at work. As millions of people were starving, British officials dogmatically refused to interfere with the grain market. Why? Because they were afraid it would disrupt the sacred invisible hand. And so the market worked perfectly. The brand new railways didn't move grain to the starving villages, they moved it to the ports, to be shipped to the UK where it could fetch a higher price. People weren't dying because there was no food in the country. They were dying because of a policy that made it impossible for them to get it.
Okay, so we've seen de-industrialization, and we've seen these policy-driven famines. And this leads us to the big idea, the master key of the nationalist critique that tied it all together. It's a theory called the drain of wealth, and it basically argued that Britain wasn't developing India at all, it was systematically bleeding it of its resources.
So how did this drain actually work? Well, a big part of it was through something called the home charges. So first, you had the salaries and pensions for all the British officials running India, paid for by India but spent in Britain. Second, military costs. India was forced to pay for a massive army that was often used to expand or defend the British Empire somewhere else entirely. And third, interest on debt for projects like those railways, which, remember, guaranteed profits to British investors. Basically, a huge chunk of the money raised in India never, ever stayed in India.
And the scale of this was just enormous. Let's put a number on it. In just 1 year, 1897 to 98, these home charges, just the official payments, ate up more than a quarter of the entire revenue collected by the government of India. Can you imagine that? Imagine if your country sent 26% of its entire national budget overseas every single year for things that brought no direct benefit back home. It was a massive, continuous hemorrhage of capital that could have been invested in India's own development, education, or industry.
So this entire history, this story of one-way free trade, of devastating famines, of a relentless financial drain, it didn't just magically end in 1947 when India finally gained its independence. No, it left a deep, deep scar, a profound sense of distrust in the very economic ideas that had been used to justify colonial rule in the first place.
You can literally see the long-term consequences right here on this timeline. After the colonial era, where the term free markets basically meant exploitation, the reaction after 1947 was a complete and total rejection of that model. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, went the completely opposite direction, creating a state-led planned economy. Why? To protect India's own industries and make sure a repeat of the colonial experience could never happen again. It was only in 1991 that India began to open up and liberalize again, but the memory of that first bitter experience, it still shapes economic debates there today.
And so that's where we'll leave it, with this final question. The story of laissez-faire economics in India is just this powerful, tragic reminder that economic ideas are not abstract theories living in a textbook. They are tools. And when those tools are wielded in a situation of massive power imbalance, the very same tool that claims to build prosperity can become a weapon of impoverishment. India's economic choices after 1947 weren't made in a vacuum. They were a direct response to the bitter memory of that knife of sugar. A nation's history, it turns out, is a ghost that haunts its economic future for generations to come.
Whew, I know that was a really deep dive into a very complex and pretty heavy period of history, but it's so important to understand. If you want to explore these connections even further and actually see a full mind map that lays out all of these arguments and counterarguments visually, please be sure to visit us on our website. Thanks so much for sticking with me on this one.